We're diving into one of the most shocking and emotional stories of the past 20 years, the war in Afghanistan. Imagine this. It's August 2021, and news breaks that the Taliban have taken over Kabul. Just like that, the government collapses, and thousands of people rush to the airport, desperate to escape. It was chaotic, heartbreaking, and it left the world stunned.
Absolutely. That moment wasn't just the end of a 20-year-long war. It raised questions about everything that happened since 2001. Why did the war begin? Why did it last so long? And most importantly, how did things get to that point?
We're going to talk about all of it, from the events of 9/11 and the U.S. invasion to the struggles of rebuilding Afghanistan, the rise of the Taliban again, and the human cost of this war. We'll also reflect on what this conflict has taught us about war and peace.
So, if you're ready to join us on this journey, stick around. It's a story full of highs and lows, triumphs and tragedies, and lessons we'll never forget.
Let's go back to the beginning. The story of the war in Afghanistan really starts in the 1990s, after years of fighting between different groups in the country. That's when the Taliban, a group of religious fighters, came to power. They promised peace and order, but their rules were extremely strict, especially for women.
Right. The Taliban followed their own harsh version of Islamic law, and life for many people became very difficult. They controlled most of Afghanistan by the late 1990s, but they didn't govern like a normal country. Instead, they gave a safe place to dangerous groups like Al-Qaeda.
Exactly. Al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden, used Afghanistan as a base to plan attacks. One of those attacks was the one we all remember. September 11th, 2001. On that day, planes were hijacked and flown into the Twin Towers in New York City and the Pentagon. Nearly 3,000 people were killed.
That attack shocked the world. Afterward, the U.S. gave an ultimatum to the Taliban: hand over Osama bin Laden and shut down Al-Qaeda's training camps. But the Taliban refused. They said bin Laden was their guest and that they couldn't just give him up.
And that's what led to the U.S. invasion. The Americans, along with their allies, decided they had to act. They launched Operation Enduring Freedom in October 2001 to remove the Taliban from power and make sure Afghanistan would no longer be a base for terrorists.
It seemed like a clear plan at first. The world supported it, and within weeks, the Taliban were forced out of major cities. But as we'll see, the roots of Afghanistan's problems go much deeper than anyone realized.
After the U.S. and its allies invaded Afghanistan in October 2001, they moved quickly. The Taliban were pushed out of Kabul, and by the end of the year, most of the country was under coalition control. For many people in Afghanistan, it felt like a new beginning.
True, the Taliban's rule was over, and the focus shifted to building a new government. In December 2001, Afghan leaders met at the Bonn Conference in Germany. This is where they chose Hamid Karzai to lead an interim government. He was seen as someone who could unite the country.
The U.S. and other countries also started helping Afghanistan rebuild. Roads, schools, and hospitals were built, and billions of dollars were sent to support the new government. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were already signs of trouble.
Right. One big problem was that many Taliban fighters didn't just disappear. They escaped to neighboring Pakistan. There, they regrouped and started planning how to fight back. At the same time, some mistakes were made by the coalition. Innocent people were sometimes caught up in raids, and this caused anger in local communities.
That's a good point. The U.S. also decided not to include the Taliban in any discussions about the new government. Some experts now think this was a missed opportunity to bring peace early on. Instead, the focus was on finding and fighting Al-Qaeda members, like Osama bin Laden.
Speaking of bin Laden, he escaped during the Battle of Tora Bora in December 2001. U.S. and Afghan forces tried to capture him in the mountains near Pakistan, but he got away. That moment really shaped the years that followed.
By 2003, the Taliban had started to reorganize under their leader, Mullah Omar. They began using guerrilla tactics, attacking Afghan forces and coalition troops. The war wasn't over, it was just changing.
Exactly. And while the coalition was focused on building Afghanistan, the Taliban were getting stronger in the shadows. It was a fragile time, and cracks were already starting to show.
By 2006, it was clear that the war was far from over. The Taliban, who had been pushed out of power, started to come back. They used new tactics and became much harder to fight.
That's right. They didn't fight like a regular army anymore. Instead, they used guerrilla warfare. They planted roadside bombs, carried out suicide attacks, and ambushed coalition forces. They also targeted Afghan soldiers and anyone who worked with the government.
A lot of their strength came from rural areas. Afghanistan is mostly made up of villages, and the Taliban knew how to hide and move around in those places. They also used Pakistan as a safe base to plan their attacks and train fighters.
Yes, and the coalition struggled to stop them. Even though more foreign troops were sent to Afghanistan during this time, it wasn't enough to control all the areas where the Taliban were active. The US and NATO forces tried to focus on protecting cities and key roads, but the countryside became a battleground.
One big challenge was that Afghan forces weren't ready to take over security. The army and police were poorly trained and didn't have enough resources. In many areas, people didn't trust them. That gave the Taliban an opening to gain support, especially by promising quick justice in areas where the government was weak.
And let's not forget the human cost. Civilian casualties started to rise during these years. Airstrikes and raids sometimes hit the wrong targets, killing innocent people. This made the coalition look bad and pushed more Afghans to support the Taliban, even if they didn't agree with their ideas.
By 2007, the Taliban controlled large parts of southern and eastern Afghanistan. That's when the US and NATO forces launched some big operations to push them back. One example was Operation Medusa in 2006, which was meant to clear out Taliban fighters in Kandahar.
Yes, and while some of those operations were successful, they didn't bring lasting peace. The Taliban would just retreat to their strongholds in the mountains or cross the border into Pakistan. Then, they'd come back when the troops left.
It was a frustrating time for the coalition. No matter how many battles they won, it felt like the Taliban were always one step ahead. The war was getting harder, and the costs, both in lives and resources, were growing.
And the Taliban were learning too. They became more organized and used media to spread their messages. They wanted people to see them as the real rulers of Afghanistan. The years from 2006 to 2010 were really when the war changed, and the fight became more complicated.
By the time Barack Obama became president in 2009, the situation in Afghanistan was serious. The Taliban were stronger than ever, and the Afghan government was struggling to control the country. So, in 2010, Obama decided to send in more troops, a move known as the surge.
Yes, around 30,000 additional U.S. troops were sent to Afghanistan. The goal was to push the Taliban out of their strongholds and give the Afghan government more time to take control. There was a big focus on southern areas like Kandahar and Helmand, where the Taliban were the strongest.
The strategy wasn't just about fighting. It also focused on winning the trust of local people. U.S. and NATO forces worked to protect villages, rebuild infrastructure, and help with schools and hospitals. They hoped this would convince people to support the government instead of the Taliban.
But it wasn't that simple. The Taliban fought back hard, using more roadside bombs and suicide attacks than ever before. These years saw some of the highest numbers of casualties for coalition forces and Afghan civilians. It was a painful time for everyone involved.
There was one major moment during this time: the killing of Osama bin Laden in May 2011. U.S. Navy SEALs found him hiding in Pakistan and carried out a secret mission to eliminate him. For many Americans, this was a huge victory.
It was, but it didn't end the war. By this point, the Taliban were no longer just fighting for bin Laden or al-Qaeda. They had become a powerful force on their own, focused on regaining control of Afghanistan. Even with bin Laden gone, their attacks continued.
In 2012, the U.S. and NATO started to shift their strategy. They wanted Afghan forces to take the lead in fighting, so they began training the Afghan army and police more seriously. By 2014, Most foreign troops had left combat roles and were focused on supporting Afghan forces instead.
That's true, but the Afghan forces still faced big problems. Many soldiers and police were poorly trained and equipped, and corruption made things worse. This made it hard for them to hold areas that the coalition had cleared of the Taliban.
Another big challenge was peace talks with the Taliban. Efforts were made to bring them to the negotiating table, but the talks didn't lead to any major agreements. The Taliban refused to recognize the Afghan government, calling it a puppet of the U.S.
By the end of 2014, the NATO combat mission officially ended, and the Afghan government was left in charge of security. But the Taliban were still strong, and many people worried that the progress made during the surge wouldn't last.
It was a turning point for the war. The U.S. and its allies had spent years fighting and rebuilding, but the future of Afghanistan still looked uncertain. The stage was set for the next chapter of this long and difficult conflict.
After NATO's combat mission ended in 2014, the Afghan government and its forces were left to handle security on their own. The U.S. and its allies stayed, but only in smaller numbers, mostly to train Afghan forces and carry out counter-terrorism missions.
But without strong international support, the Taliban started gaining more ground. By 2015, they controlled more areas than at any time since 2001. They launched major attacks, including a brief takeover of the city of Kunduz. This showed just how vulnerable the Afghan government was.
It became clear that military solutions alone weren't working. The U.S. and other countries began focusing more on diplomacy. In 2018, the U.S. started direct talks with the Taliban in Qatar. The idea was to find a way to end the fighting, but it wasn't easy.
Right. One big problem was that the Afghan government wasn't included in those talks. The Taliban refused to recognize them as legitimate. The talks focused on two main points. The U.S. wanted the Taliban to stop supporting terrorism, and the Taliban wanted all foreign troops to leave Afghanistan.
By February 2020, a deal was signed between the U.S. and the Taliban. It was called the U.S.-Taliban Agreement. The U.S. promised to withdraw all its troops by May 2021, and the Taliban agreed not to let Afghanistan be used as a base for attacks against the U.S. or its allies.
But there was a catch. The Afghan government wasn't part of the deal, and they didn't agree with some of its terms, especially the release of 5,000 Taliban prisoners. Still, they eventually went along with it under pressure from the U.S.
After the deal, U.S. and NATO forces began leaving Afghanistan. At the same time, the Taliban launched more attacks. Even though they promised to stop targeting foreign troops, they kept fighting Afghan soldiers and police.
Exactly. The Afghan forces were left to defend the country, but they were already struggling with low morale and corruption. Many soldiers weren't getting paid, and some even surrendered to the Taliban without a fight.
Meanwhile, peace talks between the Afghan government and the Taliban started in September 2020, but they didn't make much progress. Both sides wanted different things, and the fighting continued across the country.
By the end of 2020, the situation was getting worse. The Taliban were stronger than ever, and it was clear that the Afghan government would face serious challenges once the last foreign troops left. The stage was set for the dramatic events of 2021.
In 2021, everything changed. The U.S. had already agreed to leave Afghanistan, and by the summer, most foreign troops were gone. But what no one expected was how quickly the Taliban would take over.
That's true. By May, the Taliban started a major offensive. They didn't just target villages or small towns, they went after key cities and provincial capitals. Afghan forces tried to hold their ground, but the Taliban moved faster than anyone imagined.
A big reason for this was that many Afghan soldiers stopped fighting. Some surrendered without a fight, handing their weapons and bases over to the Taliban. Others fled. Many soldiers hadn't been paid for months, and they felt abandoned by their leaders.
And it wasn't just soldiers. Civilians were caught in the middle. By July, the Taliban controlled half of Afghanistan. People in cities like Kandahar and Herat were terrified as the fighting came closer. Refugees started flooding into Kabul, hoping to find safety.
On August 15th, The situation reached its breaking point. The Taliban entered Kabul without much resistance. The Afghan president, Ashraf Ghani, fled the country. By the end of the day, the Taliban were in full control of the capital.
Those scenes from Kabul were unforgettable. Thousands of people rushed to the airport, trying to escape. There were crowds on the runways, people climbing onto planes, and heartbreaking images of families being separated. It was chaos.
The U.S. and other countries scrambled to evacuate their citizens and Afghan allies. Over the next 2 weeks, more than 120,000 people were flown out. But not everyone made it. Many Afghans who had worked with foreign forces were left behind, fearing for their lives.
For the Taliban, this was a huge victory. They declared the war over and took control of the entire country. But for the Afghan people, it was the beginning of a new, uncertain chapter. Many feared a return to the harsh rule they had experienced before 2001.
And the rest of the world was left asking big questions. How did things fall apart so quickly? Was there anything more that could have been done? And what does this mean for the future of Afghanistan?
It's a story that's still unfolding. What's clear is that the 20-year war changed Afghanistan forever and left lessons for the world about the cost of war and the challenge of building peace.
Absolutely. The war may be over, but the impact will be felt for years to come.
When we talk about the war in Afghanistan, it's easy to focus on the battles, the politics, and the strategies. But we can't forget the people who lived through it. The human cost of this war was enormous.
It really was. Over 200,000 people died, including around 46,000 civilians. These were ordinary men, women, and children caught in the crossfire. Bombings, airstrikes, and roadside bombs turned homes, schools, and markets into dangerous places.
And the suffering didn't stop with the deaths. Millions of Afghans lost their homes during the war. By the time the Taliban returned to power in 2021, over 2.6 million people had fled the country, becoming refugees. Another 4 million were displaced inside Afghanistan. Imagine losing everything you know and having to start over somewhere else.
It's heartbreaking. And even for those who stayed, life was difficult. Many people lived in poverty, struggled to find work, and didn't have access to basic services like healthcare and education. For women especially, the war made life even harder, with the Taliban's strict rules limiting their freedom.
The war also left a huge impact on the soldiers who fought in it. Many U.S. and NATO troops came home with physical injuries and mental health struggles, like PTSD. For Afghan soldiers, the pain was even greater. They lost family members, homes, and their sense of safety.
And what about the country itself? After 20 years of war, Afghanistan's economy was in ruins. Roads, schools, and hospitals had been rebuilt in some areas. But corruption and poor leadership held the country back. When the Taliban returned, much of the progress fell apart.
But there were some moments of hope, too. During the years of the war, millions of Afghan children, especially girls, got to go to school for the first time. People started dreaming of a better future. It's tragic that so much of that hope was lost when the Taliban took over again.
The war also taught the world some hard lessons. It showed how difficult it is to rebuild a country after years of conflict. It also reminded us that wars don't just end on the battlefield. The scars they leave on people, families, and nations last for generations.
And now, the world is watching Afghanistan again, wondering what the future holds. Will the country find peace? Will the people who suffered so much finally get a chance to rebuild their lives? Only time will tell.
One thing is for sure. We owe it to those who lived through this war to learn from it. Whether it's the soldiers who fought, the leaders who made decisions, or the families who lost everything, their stories matter.
Absolutely. Their stories remind us of the real cost of war and why peace is always worth fighting for.
So, after everything we've talked about, the rise of the Taliban, the U.S. invasion, the years of fighting, and the collapse of the Afghan government, it's clear that the war in Afghanistan is more than just a chapter in history. It's a story of human struggle, resilience, and lessons we all need to learn.
Absolutely. This war lasted 20 years, took thousands of lives, and affected millions more. It showed us how complex war can be and how hard it is to rebuild a country. But it also reminded us of the importance of hope, even in the darkest times.
And while the war is officially over, its impact isn't. Afghanistan's people are still facing enormous challenges, and the world has a responsibility to not turn away.
That's right. If there's one thing we can take from this story, it's that war has consequences far beyond the battlefield. It's a lesson in how important peace, understanding, and careful leadership really are.
Thanks for joining us today to explore this important story. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment.
And let us know, whose story or biography should we cover next? We'd love to hear your ideas. Take care, and we'll see you next time.